Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini loved to portray himself as the embodiment of strength, masculinity, and authority. From his speeches filled with fiery nationalism to his grand parades where he puffed out his chest like a Roman emperor, Mussolini built his entire identity around the idea of being untouchable. He was the self-proclaimed savior of Italy, the man who declared that the glory of Rome would never fall again. To many Italians, however, his bravado eventually revealed itself as hollow. Behind the image of power lay a dictator who dragged his country into disaster, aligning with Hitler's Germany and plunging Italy into a war it was not prepared to fight. By the mid-1940s, things had unraveled quickly. Italy's cities were bombed, its armies defeated, and its people hungry and exhausted. Mussolini's grip on power loosened with every passing month. The once cheering crowds now muttered curses under their breath. The same man who had strutted across balconies, arms outstretched like a Caesar, was now a cornered leader, desperately looking for an exit as Allied forces closed in on the country. In April 1945, as the Axis powers collapsed, Mussolini attempted one last escape. He wasn't heading to Rome to make a final stand, nor was he trying to negotiate peace for his people. Instead, he dressed in disguise and fled north with his mistress, Claretta Petacci, hoping to cross into Switzerland. Switzerland, of all places, the land of neutrality. The irony was painful. The man who had shouted about eternal Rome was now just another fugitive, sneaking across the border like a petty criminal. But fate had other plans.
Mussolini was recognized and captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como. These were not men who had forgotten the suffering his rule had caused. They didn't see a strong leader anymore. They saw a tyrant responsible for years of repression, war, and death. There was no trial, no final speech to save face. The decision was swift. He and Claretta were executed by firing squad on April 28, 1945. Yet death was only the beginning of his humiliation. His body, along with Petacci's, was transported to Milan. Instead of a dignified burial, Mussolini was dumped like trash in a public square. His corpse was strung upside down at a gas station, exposed for all to see. Crowds gathered in fury, spitting, kicking, and throwing rocks at his lifeless body. The once mighty Il Duce, who demanded loyalty and worship, was now a spectacle of scorn. Children pointed. Adults cursed. The Italian people who had been forced to bow to his image for decades finally had their revenge. It was a far cry from the grand vision Mussolini had for himself. He wanted to be remembered as the rebuilder of the Roman Empire, the eternal leader who restored Italy's greatness. Instead, his legacy became a cautionary tale, a dictator who led with arrogance, collapsed in failure, and died with zero dignity. In the end, Mussolini wasn't feared, he wasn't respected. He was mocked, discarded, and remembered not as a hero, but as a warning of how far the mighty can fall.
Nicolae Ceausescu. Nicolae Ceausescu ruled Romania with an iron fist for decades. His regime was built on fear, surveillance, and propaganda that painted him as a beloved leader. But beneath that image, ordinary Romanians suffered from food shortages, blackouts, and relentless control over their lives. By the late 1980s, the cracks in his dictatorship were impossible to hide. In December 1989, protests erupted in Timișoara and quickly spread across the country. Ceausescu, convinced he could still command loyalty, stepped out onto a balcony in Bucharest to deliver one of his signature speeches. At first, the crowd listened in silence, but then, for the first time in his rule, the silence broke into boos and jeers. The look on his face said it all: shock, confusion, and panic. His carefully crafted image as a leader adored by the masses shattered in real time, broadcast across national television. Desperate to maintain control,
Ceausescu called in helicopters and attempted to flee the capital with his wife, Elena. But the revolution was already moving faster than he could. Protesters, the military, and even members of his own party had turned against him. Within days, the couple was captured. On December 25th, Christmas Day, Ceausescu and his wife were put through a brief, chaotic trial. The charges ranged from genocide to undermining the state, but the verdict was already written: death. Moments later, the two were lined up against a wall and executed by firing squad. Reports say over 100 bullets tore through their bodies, leaving no doubt that Romania had closed the door on its dictatorship. For a man who once believed his rule would last forever, the timing of his downfall carried a bitter irony. On a day meant for peace and celebration, Ceausescu's reign ended in violence, a final brutal gift of history that said, "Merry Christmas, you're done."
Saddam Hussein. For years, Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq like a king. He built palaces adorned with marble and gold, lived in absolute luxury, and presented himself as an unshakable strongman. His portraits and statues loomed over every city, reminding the people who was in charge. But behind the wealth and the bravado was a regime that thrived on fear, torture, and absolute control. Saddam believed he was untouchable. That illusion didn't last. In 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, his empire unraveled almost overnight. The palaces were stormed, his statues pulled down, and the Iraqi people, who once had to chant his name in public, began celebrating his downfall. For months, he disappeared from sight. Rumors swirled about underground bunkers or foreign hideouts. Surely a man who had lived like royalty wouldn't just vanish into the dirt? But that's exactly what happened. In December 2003, U.S. forces found Saddam not in some fortified stronghold, but hiding in a cramped spider hole near his hometown of Tikrit. The once feared dictator was dragged out of the ground, disheveled, bearded, and filthy. Gone was the polished image from propaganda posters. What remained was a broken man who looked nothing like the leader who had terrorized the nation. His capture led to a highly publicized trial where Saddam defiantly shouted and argued, trying to hold on to the last shreds of his authority. When the guilty verdict came, he requested execution by firing squad, claiming it was a soldier's death worthy of his status. Instead, the court ordered he be hanged like a common criminal. On December 30th, 2006, that sentence was carried out. But the final insult came when a secret recording of the execution leaked online. The man who once demanded absolute control over his image and legacy ended up immortalized in a shaky, grainy video. The feared dictator of Iraq went out not with grandeur, but as a viral clip, a humiliating end for a man who once thought himself untouchable.
Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo was Japan's wartime prime minister, the face of the military machine that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor and dragged much of Asia into a brutal conflict. For years, he symbolized loyalty to the emperor and Japan's militaristic ambitions. His speeches radiated confidence, his posture unyielding, as if he were destined to lead Japan to dominance. But as World War II turned against Japan, the image of strength began to crack. By 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the emperor's surrender, Tojo's fate was sealed. When American soldiers came to arrest him at his Tokyo home in September 1945, Tojo decided he would deny them the satisfaction of capturing him alive. He pulled out a pistol, pointed it at his chest, and fired. This was supposed to be his grand exit, an honorable suicide in line with the samurai code. But there was one problem. He missed. Instead of piercing his heart, the bullet tore through his stomach. He collapsed, bleeding heavily, but still alive. Neighbors gathered in shock as Tojo, pale and gasping, actually apologized for not dying quickly enough. The strong man, who had demanded so much sacrifice from others, couldn't even deliver his own clean ending. American medics rushed in, and instead of letting him die, they worked frantically to save him, not out of mercy, but because they wanted him alive
alive for trial. The irony was sharp. Tojo wanted control over his death, but his enemies refused to grant him that control. He was patched up, bandaged, and nursed back to health just so he could stand in court. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East put him on trial for war crimes. He sat in the courtroom no longer as a feared leader, but as a frail defendant, forced to listen to his empire's atrocities were laid out in detail. His defiance continued through the trial, but it couldn't change the outcome. In 1948, Hideki Tojo was sentenced to death. On December 23rd, he was hanged. The man who had once dreamed of an empire spanning Asia ended up dangling from a rope, denied even the dignity of choosing his own end. For someone who had demanded total obedience and sacrificed millions, the humiliation was complete. He couldn't control his country's destiny, he couldn't control his trial, and in the end, he couldn't even control his own death.
Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron grip, and for decades his name alone was enough to send shivers down the spine of millions. He was the architect of mass purges, labor camps, forced famines, and ruthless political repression. His paranoia was legendary. Friends, generals, even family members could vanish overnight if he suspected disloyalty. People praised him in public, but in private, they whispered and trembled. Stalin wasn't just a leader, he was a shadow hanging over every life in the USSR. Yet for all the terror he inspired, the way he died was strangely undramatic, and in many ways ironic. In early March 1953, Stalin suffered a massive stroke while at his dacha outside Moscow. He collapsed in his room, unable to move, lying helpless on the floor. For most people, medical help would be called immediately, but Stalin wasn't most people. His guards and staff, conditioned by years of fear, hesitated. They worried that if he was merely resting and they disturbed him, he would have them executed. So they waited. Hours passed while Stalin lay there, half-conscious, drifting between life and death, and no one dared open the door. The delay sealed his fate. By the time anyone finally checked on him, it was too late. The man who had ordered the deaths of millions lost his own chance at survival, not because of enemies or assassins, but because of the fear he had cultivated in those closest to him. The empire of terror had come full circle, claiming even its master. When the news of his death broke, the Soviet Union erupted in chaos. Crowds surged to Moscow to see his body lying in state. The crush of mourners was so overwhelming that people were trampled to death in the streets, desperate just to catch a glimpse of the man who had ruled them for 3 decades. Even in death, Stalin's presence sowed misery. His funeral was staged as a grand event, filled with pomp and speeches about his greatness. But behind the public spectacle, there was relief among his colleagues. Many of the men who had lived in fear of his purges finally saw a chance to breathe again. The silence of his final hours, when no one dared to enter his room, said more about his legacy than the thousands of statues and posters ever could. Stalin wanted to be remembered as the invincible father of nations, the man who industrialized the Soviet Union and led it to victory in World War II. But his death revealed the darker truth. He was so feared that when he needed help most, no one dared to lift a hand. He left the world not as a mighty general or revered leader, but as a lonely old man lying on the floor, betrayed by the very terror that had sustained his power.
Pol Pot. Pol Pot was one of the 20th century's darkest figures, the mastermind behind Cambodia's genocide that wiped out nearly 2 million people. He envisioned an agrarian utopia, but delivered one of history's most brutal nightmares. Entire cities were emptied, intellectuals and professionals were executed, and the countryside became a network of killing fields. For years, Pol Pot ruled through fear, convinced he could outmaneuver not just his enemies, but fate itself. But fate has a funny way of catching up. By the 1990s, his grip on power had weakened. The Khmer Rouge, his own comrades who once followed him with blind loyalty, began turning against him.
Infighting, betrayals, and shifting allegiances left him isolated. No longer the untouchable dictator who terrified a nation, Pol Pot was reduced to a frail old man, watched over not by bodyguards, but by captors. His downfall wasn't a dramatic execution or sudden collapse like some other dictators. Instead, it was humiliation stretched out over time. He was tried by his own movement in a makeshift people's court, found guilty of crimes against the very group he had led, and placed under house arrest. Imagine going from commanding armies to being confined to a shack in the jungle, stripped of influence, abandoned by allies. In 1998, his end came quietly, though the exact cause remains debated. The official story says he died of a heart attack, but many believe he took poison when he realized he was about to be handed over to the United States. For a man obsessed with control, the idea of being put on trial by outsiders may have been unbearable. Whether by his own hand or by nature, the timing was ironic. He escaped human justice only to face the slow grind of fate. Pol Pot's final days were the mirror opposite of his reign. No chants, no parades, no terror in people's eyes. Just a fading, sickly figure, powerless and paranoid, left to die in obscurity. For someone who orchestrated mass suffering, his weak, quiet ending feels less like an accident and more like the universe balancing the scales. Karma in slow motion.
Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco spent decades running Spain like it was his personal playground, ruling with an iron fist that brooked no opposition. The man had power, fear, and a reputation for never backing down. But by the early 1970s, that unstoppable image started to crack. His body, just like the world around him, wasn't cooperating anymore. Illness after illness began piling up. He had hospital stays, surgeries, long stretches in bed. Friends, aides, and doctors all watched the once mighty dictator slowly become weaker, more frail. And Franco? He hated it. A man who had spent his life controlling others was suddenly at the mercy of medicine, nurses, and his own failing body. The irony would have been delicious to anyone who suffered under his rule. Here was a guy who had denied freedom, democracy, and choice for decades, now powerless in his own private war. Despite everything, Franco clung to life as stubbornly as he clung to power. His aides managed him like fragile royalty, making sure he was comfortable, carefully administering medications, trying to stabilize a body that just wasn't built to keep going forever. But the truth was brutal. He was watching a world move on without him. Spain, the country he had shaped and molded with fear, was preparing to step into a future that didn't need him. The monarchy was being restored. Democratic reforms were brewing, and the young leaders who would shape Spain's next era were waiting for him to exit the stage. Franco died on November 20th, 1975, at the age of 82. It wasn't dramatic. No assassins, no revolts, no public uprising marking his final moments. Just a long, slow fade, surrounded by doctors and family, a man who had wielded the ultimate power over millions, reduced to the quiet ticking of hospital monitors and whispered medical updates. The timing was almost poetic. His death fell on the 39th anniversary of the death of José Antonio Primo de Rivera, founder of Spain's Falange movement, symbolically linking Franco's life to the regime he helped cement. Yet the bigger story was outside his hospital walls. Spain was moving forward. Prince Juan Carlos, whom Franco had named as his successor years earlier, officially took the reins. The nation began the painful, messy, but ultimately hopeful transition to democracy, all while Franco's legacy lingered as a cautionary tale. In the end, Francisco Franco's life serves as a reminder that no matter how much control you think you have, time eventually takes it all away. He didn't die in battle, didn't get toppled by a revolution, and didn't face a violent end. Instead, he lingered long enough to see the world he had tried to dominate move on without him. There's a certain bitter irony in that. Outliving your era isn't always a victory. Sometimes it's the cruelest way to watch your empire crumble while you're still alive to witness it.
Adolf Hitler.
By early 1945, Hitler's world was literally collapsing. Berlin was a city under siege, bombs raining down, streets reduced to rubble, and Soviet forces pushing in from the east while the Allies advanced from the west. Inside his underground bunker, the air was thick with tension, fear, and paranoia. Hitler's top generals, the very men who had once executed his every order without question, were now acting behind his back, fleeing, negotiating, or outright defying him. Betrayal was everywhere. Hitler's fury was unmatched. The man who had once commanded unwavering loyalty now found himself isolated, distrusting even his closest advisors. Some were purged, others sidelined, and the bunker became a powder keg of fear and suspicion. Hitler's control was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Amid this chaos, on April 28, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun. The ceremony was small, rushed, almost an afterthought, a symbolic gesture rather than a romantic one. It was as if he knew time had run out and he wanted to formalize what little personal life he had left before the end came. The very next day, Hitler received news that Mussolini had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. It was a bitter confirmation. Even other dictators, like him, weren't immune to violent, humiliating ends. For Hitler, it was a warning he would not be taken alive. He began finalizing his plan. April 30th, 1945, Soviet troops were now just 1,600 feet from the bunker. Hitler and Eva Braun took their final steps. In a private moment away from prying eyes, he shot himself in the head while she bit down on a cyanide capsule. Their exit was deliberate, controlled, and in a strange sense, tragic. But even in death, Hitler couldn't escape symbolism. Their bodies were carried outside, doused with gasoline, and set ablaze as artillery shells shook the city. The bunker, once a hub of power and fear, became a charred ruin, a final monument to the collapse of the Third Reich. Berlin surrendered on May 2nd, 1945. Hitler's death, while monumental in historical consequence, was almost anticlimactic in its reality. For a man responsible for unparalleled chaos, destruction, and death, his own demise was reduced to ashes and bones. The only confirmed evidence of his end came from his dental records, and it wasn't until 1956 that a German court officially issued his death certificate. Hitler's fall serves as the ultimate lesson in the fragility of power. No matter how much fear, manipulation, or control one wields, the end can be sudden, ignoble, and entirely out of one's hands. From a world dictator to burned remnants in a ruined city, Hitler's story ended not with grandeur, but with the quiet, destructive finality of a world that had finally turned against him.